All right, welcome everybody who's joining. I know that we're at time. We're just going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes so that we can allow more working group members to join. All right, I think we're getting some critical mass here, so I think we could start. Hi everybody, welcome to our first policy working group meeting. It's great to see you all, and thanks for to most of you for showing your faces here so I could see them, even if they're kind of thumbnail size, given how big this group is. So a couple of things before I launch into a presentation. I wanted to start in this mode so that we can get the sense that we're all a group here and we're all going to be working pretty intensively together over the next couple of months. My name is Edith Bayer. I'm Energy Policy Team Lead here at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'll be kicking us off today. I just want to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded. I don't know if we've pushed the recording button yet. I don't see it. Oh, no, it is. Okay. So just wanted to make sure that that was happening. And I'm going to take a moment to, to share my screen with you all and get us going. All right, so making sure you all are in the right room. This is the first meeting for the policy working groups for the Oregon Energy Strategy. I want to start with just a few words about the Oregon Department of Energy. House Bill 3630 asks the Oregon Department of Energy to lead development of an energy strategy for our state. And that role is very much in line with our mission, which is to help Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. The work that we're undertaking here with you all, and that has gone into the development of the modeling, which you'll hear more about today, also aligns with our role as a central repository of energy data, information, and analysis, and as a venue for problem solving Oregon's energy challenges. Here are a few pointers for how to navigate the screen you all are seeing on your computers. Feel free, you can see over here on the right, to raise your hand, to use the chat function, and to turn on your camera, and I see many of you have. I'd also like to just remind you to keep yourselves on mute so we don't get any background interference. And if you have any technical issues, please send a direct message in the chat to Josh Price, who can help you with those. If you're calling in to listen but are not in a working group, you won't see that chat function. However, we have a comment portal on our website for this project, and welcome comments there. So today is our first meeting together, and I'm here to talk about the role of your group and what to expect over the next several meetings. We also want to take you a bit more deeply into the results of the modeling to ground you in the modeling approach and key findings. And that presentation will build on the presentation that we asked you to either join or listen to a recording to from January 31st. And then towards the end of today's meeting, you'll have some time in your topical working group to get to know each other, to meet the person from Odo who will be leading your group, and to get a preview of what's coming next. As you can see, we'll give you a 10-minute break in here. This is a long meeting, after which there'll be a chance for questions and answers. So the way that we'd like to suggest running this meeting is that we'll be monitoring the chat for questions throughout, and then we'll plan to run through those questions from the chat during that Q&A window. So please go ahead and put your questions in as they come to you. Sometimes we might be able to help respond in writing, kind of on the go. And excuse me. And we'll just run through the presentations in the first part, and then after the break, we'll turn to Q&A. You can also see here for the breakout group introductions who the leads are for each of the working groups. I'm just going to run through their names so that you recognize them. Jillian DeMedio is leading transportation electrification, Joni Sliger, developing clean electricity generation and transmission, Michael Frios, low carbon fuels, Rob Delmar, building efficiency, electrification, and distributed energy resources, and Lauren Rosenstein, environmental justice and equity. And for the environmental justice and equity group, I'd like to remind you all that you're welcome to join the other working groups. I know that Lauren has been in touch with many of you to help determine which group you're interested in joining. If you've not responded to Lauren's email or unclear on which working group you want to be in, drop Josh a message in the chat and bear with us while we get you into a group. And there's also an option at as we break out into groups to just click on a group and select it. So a few ground rules for today and throughout your working groups, which are really important since we have a lot of different perspectives and areas of expertise in the room. And this is about having a constructive and effective process. It doesn't mean that we need to agree on everything, but it's important to leave space for everyone. So I'm just going to walk through these. So first, we ask you to honor the agenda or modify it as a group by agreement. Listen carefully, seek to learn and understand each other's perspective, encourage respectful, candid, and constructive conversation. Keep an open mind, ask questions to clarify and understand why, be open, transparent, inclusive, and accountable, respect differing opinions in the room, seek to resolve differences wherever possible and find common ground, and be conscious of your speaking time. So make sure that if you tend to speak a lot, step back and allow space for others to contribute, and limit chat conversations. We certainly want you to put your questions into the chat today, but if the chat becomes a whole conversation in and of itself, it distracts from the conversation that's happening kind of verbally in the room. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on the energy strategy to just get us all in the same place. In 2022, in our biennial energy report, Odo undertook an evaluation of how we meet our energy policy objectives. We recognized that we have pretty ambitious climate and energy goals across electricity, fuels, and really economy-wide. And what we do in one sector affects the other, but we didn't have a view of the whole energy system to help make informed choices. And so we undertook an exercise where we looked at other states and other studies and concluded that Oregon would benefit from having an energy strategy to address equity, to assess different pathways to meeting our energy goals, to understand the trade-offs, and really to chart an intentional course to meeting our energy policy objectives. Then fast forward to the summer of 2023, and the legislature through House Bill 3630 asked us to do exactly this. That bill directs Odo to identify different pathways to achieving our state's energy policy objectives and to develop develop recommendations for energy policies to help meet our goals, all with robust engagement. So there are three elements to the energy strategy. First, there's the work to identify pathways to achieve our energy policy objectives. And over the past year, we've worked to undertake an analysis to do this. We chose consultants through a competitive process, the Clean Energy Transition Institute, who's here today, as well as Evolved Energy Research, who has been leading the modeling. And we engaged in conversations with working groups, with our advisory group, with other agencies, and through public forums and listening sessions to inform the data that went into that analysis, the assumptions, and the scenarios, and you'll hear more about that today. The modeling serves to provide a foundation to inform policy discussions, which is what we're all kicking off today. And at the end of this process, we'll be pulling everything into a report which will describe pathways, recommendations, how we engaged, and what we did with the feedback that we received. The final report is due to the governor and legislature by November 1st of this year. So what is the role of your working groups, and how do you fit in the bigger picture? I want to start with that bigger picture. Working groups are really central to this process, but you can see that we're engaging on a number of levels. We're engaging in discussions with tribes. We have an advisory group that meets once a month. We have an interagency steering group that focuses on ensuring state agency coordination. We also have public forums or listening sessions that provide an opportunity to collect broad views from across the state. You all are the lucky ones with, I'll call it the most robust engagement schedule, where we really will be digging most deeply into the weeds on kind of walking through from the results of the modeling to coming up with ideas for policy recommendations. So we have 5 policy working groups. You can see them here. We have the Environmental Justice and Equity Group, Building Efficiency, Electrification, and Distributed Energy Resources, Developing Clean Electricity Generation and Transmission, Low Carbon Fuel Solutions, and Transportation Electrification. Some of you may have participated in the working groups last summer that informed the modeling. This time we're turning to policy, and we've restructured the working groups to fit that focus. Here's a quick view of, I'd say, a bird's eye view of what each group is focusing on. I'm not going to read through this in detail. This is really for your review later. You'll be going into breakouts today to dig into what your working group will be focusing on, but I also wanted to provide this slide so that you could get a sense and also look back at the materials of how you fit in the bigger picture topically and what the other groups are focusing on. So each of you plays an essential role in this process. You're here to substantively engage on the results of the modeling, of the other complementary analysis, and to discuss how we meet our climate and energy goals and what recommendations we might need to get there. We're relying on you to help us consider the costs and benefits of different pathways, to identify barriers and gaps, and to surface near-term policy ideas for consideration. It's also important to be clear about what the role of the working groups is not. So we're not revisiting the modeling inputs or analysis. We're seeking to understand how it can help us shape policy recommendations and identify needs and identify pathways. You're not here to vote on recommendations. And the working groups aren't here to make final decisions. As you saw earlier, there are other groups informing the discussions. There are other kind of types of engagement that or forums for engagement. This is one of them, and this is the most in-depth one, but we will be taking into account what we hear from all the other groups as well in drafting recommendations. So there's a lot that we need to do here, and it's important for us to be able to work together effectively. And so I want to make sure with this slide that we have a shared understanding of your role, and that you have an understanding of your role and the role of your group, especially given the time commitment that you all are making, and which we very much appreciate. So when you were invited to join your working group, you received a summary of the expectations for the working groups, and I think it was a 2-page document. So here's a summary of those expectations, and I just want to emphasize a few things. One is that it's really important to keep the meetings focused on the agenda for each meeting, because each meeting will build on the last one, and there's a progression, which I'll get into shortly. It's important to participate openly, honestly, respectfully, respect differing views in the room, and seek common ground where possible. And finally, we're not here to contest or revisit the state's climate goals, the validity of climate science, or Oregon's commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're really here to problem solve and to do what House Bill 3630 asks us to do, which is to identify pathways to meeting those goals and talk about what the additional policy needs might be to get us there. Our team at ODA will be working very hard to provide the platform for this discussion and to enable meaningful discussions to happen. So your groups are designed to be this platform for kind of deep discussion. It's also important that all perspectives have a kind of a chance to be surfaced, and it's really important to recognize kind of your role as one of those voices to raise different perspectives throughout the process. It's also really valuable to identify areas of alignment, especially across varied interests and perspectives. Where we see alignment surfacing, that gives us a really strong signal that there's an area here to dig into more, lean into, and consider strongly. And we'll also encourage identifying those areas of alignment, recognizing that we won't align on everything. So this is kind of how we're structuring the groups and ways that we're hoping to make sure that we can make the conversation honest and effective. I also want to add that our role, Odo's role in the process, is to frame up these conversations, to listen carefully and to consider everything we hear, and to make sure that we provide an opportunity for iteration as we work through the discussions. We also commit to being as transparent as possible. Anyone can listen to the working group meetings, and I think we have several people from outside of the working groups listening in today, and we'll work to provide recordings and notes from all of the meetings as well for anybody who isn't able to be there, or particularly from outside of the working groups who's interested in what we've been talking about in the working groups. So I'm now going to turn to a little bit of the process over the next few months. So you might be asking yourself questions like, does my contribution count, or how do I make the most valuable contribution? How do I make the best use of my time? So here's a summary of the process that gets us to recommendations and to a final energy strategy. So you can see from February to April, there's really a deep opportunity to inform our thinking. And the bold red here on the slide kind of represents the opportunities to kind of inform the thinking and to weigh in. So the first one are just the working groups meetings that we're going to have over the next several months. In May, we will pull together everything that we've heard from you all and from our engagement with the advisory interagency group and the public forums that we'll be holding. And we will present some draft recommendations. And that will be another opportunity for you to ask questions. And then in late May, early June, we'll be releasing final draft recommendations for written feedback. And that written feedback is something that we review really carefully. I'll say that the written feedback we received last summer and early fall relating to the modeling was very valuable, and we updated a number of modeling assumptions to incorporate the feedback that we received. So that's a really important moment in the process as well. And then we'll get to drafting and pulling together the policy recommendations and the modeling findings and the engagement process all into a final report. And then there'll also be an opportunity to see that final report before we submit it to the governor and legislature. So I want to now turn to, at a high level, what the modeling considered. So we're kind of jumping in at the end where we have the modeling results, and we're going to start getting into discussions. And so what I want to start with is to just summarize some of the factors that House Bill 3630 lists and asks us to consider, and just to remind us of some of what has already gone into the modeling. So state laws, policies, and targets relating to energy and greenhouse gas emissions were all considered in the modeling. Existing energy and integrated resource plans were also reviewed and considered. We looked at other energy related studies and data analysis, both from Oregon and regional studies, so things like Power Council, BPA, and other studies. We also incorporated state energy policy objectives into the technical analysis, state energy demands and trends, energy resources and technologies that are available to help us meet our energy needs. And we also looked at the role of emerging technologies. So all of these are things that we have considered and that we engaged in over the last several months to inform the modeling, and that have gone into the modeling. However, we know that the modeling results don't tell us everything that we need to know, and there are a lot of the most important things that we'll need to talk about in our groups include other considerations. So I have another animated slide here for you all. So the modeling gets us partway there, particularly in understanding what an economy-wide least cost pathway is. We also get a sense of feasibility by looking at existing technology costs and cost projections in the modeling. We also got a general sense, and you'll see this in the presentation today, of the land use footprint associated with different pathways or different scenarios in the model. However, the modeling doesn't tell us everything about these three topics. It gives us a broad sense and a directional sense. And there are also other considerations that are really important to include in the conversation. So the modeling doesn't and the modeling results don't tell us how we can make sure that the transition is equitable, affordable, or how to ensure that no particular group is disproportionately burdened. We're undertaking complementary analysis, which will be presented in a few weeks to help better inform these discussions by showing the results of an analysis that looks at the energy wallet of different households and how that's affected by different pathways, and looking at air quality and looking at some geospatial maps to inform the policy discussions. It's also important to consider resilience from a system and from a community perspective, and that's also something that the working groups will be focusing on, but that is not a direct output from the model. It's also important to consider community benefits as well as economic and employment effects. So there's a lot to consider here. This again is all anchored in the bill, so it's not an exhaustive list, but I think that many of the topics that you all have in mind and that are important to you fall kind of within these broad topic areas. And it's going to be really important to recognize that this is going to be a really important part of the conversation. The balance between these considerations may be different when we talk about different technologies or different solutions, and they may be different for you than someone else in your working group. It's really important to ensure an equitable energy transition and to maintain a strong lens on equity, affordability, and environmental justice. And so we'll really want to dig into those areas. And so this slide really illustrates where the hard work lies for us and for our groups, and we'll be looking to you to help us think through these criteria while making sure that to help us identify pathways to meet our clean energy policy objectives, while making sure that we're considering a broader set of benefits, costs, and risks. And it'll be really important to get your views on all of these perspectives. Okay, so I kind of now want to move us from the modeling to the working groups. So the modeling tells us the what are our options for different pathways? What do we need to do to meet our clean energy objectives? And the focus of the working groups is really primarily going to be on the how. So it builds off of the modeling results, but what we're going to be talking about is how do we achieve this? What's needed? What do we have in place? And what more do we need to do? So you're going to be working through a series of topics in your working group, and I'm going to try to walk through step by step the progression that we have in mind. So we're going to start with the discussion of the key model findings, and then work to understand where are we today compared with the direction that the modeling is indicating. And then what policies are affecting that pathway? What policies do we have in place today? What are the gaps and barriers to get us from where we are today to where we need to go? And then this top row here builds up to defining, to understanding the foundation, to define a series of issue statements that sum up the challenge that we need to, or the many challenges that we need to overcome. Help us define strategies to overcome gaps and barriers, and ultimately get to proposed policy actions. So I realize this might feel a little abstract, so I'm going to walk through an example one by one. So an example of a key model finding, and again, you can see here at the top in red, and I just want to emphasize this is an example for illustration. Many people will have synapses firing about what else could go into this slide, and that's great because that's exactly the exercise that we want to go through. So here's just one example of a key finding. Per capita residential energy use falls by 47% by 2050 in the reference scenario, largely due to the transition to heat pumps. So that is a starting point for a conversation of what the modeling tells us. And then if we look to where are we today, we have to look often beyond the model to understand what current trends are. So this number is from our most recent biennial energy report. Oregon achieved 50.96 average megawatts of electricity savings in Oregon in 2022. That's across all sectors, but it's a data point that we can use. And we had approximately 46,000 heat pump sales in Oregon in 2022. So that's another data point that can help us understand where we are compared to where we need to be going. And there are a number of policies affecting this pathway. So we have a goal of having 500,000 heat pumps installed by 2030. We have rebate and incentive programs in place. And there are also a number of gaps and barriers. And so the working group might identify some of these barriers related to this key finding. So high upfront cost, support for building weatherization, a shortage of skilled installers, as well as the need for awareness raising. So all of this then can inform an issue statement. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve? So in this case, heat pumps, space and water heaters face barriers that limit adoption. With adequate policies to increase adoption, Oregon can reduce costs of the clean energy transition. And again, I'm not saying this is an issue statement that we've come up with, but it's an example. And then what are some proposed strategies to address those barriers? Well, we might want to expand residential access by funding organizations that can increase outreach and add repair funds to programs. We might talk about adapting energy codes to align with our clean energy goals. And then we'll be working to define some proposed policies. So there are sort of three flavors of proposed policy recommendations and the sort of group categories that they might fall in. So we might want to propose continuing existing policies or expanding on existing policies that are really important and that are working. We might have recommendations for new policies, or there might be areas that require further study. So again, this is just a quick example for you all, and you'll hear more about this process from your working group leads when we break out towards the end of the meeting. So this is a table that kind of summarizes that first row that I just showed. I just wanted to show this to make a point that really what you're doing as working groups is helping us develop the scaffolding for the policy recommendations. And so while I've said that other groups will also inform what the final recommendations will be, we're not just pulling recommendations out of thin air. We have a process in mind here that's deliberate, that's has a data-based, evidence-based foundation, and that really walks us through kind of where we are, where we're going, and what we need to get there. And here's another slide that again shows kind of that same information in table format. And I just wanted to show this partly also so that you can see that each working group will be covering different topics. So this is an example for the buildings working group. So this topic of electrification will be one topic that you talk about. You'll be talking about energy efficiency. You'll be talking about rooftop solar and batteries and demand response. And so you can imagine undertaking this exercise through these different topics. So now I want to just touch briefly on the meeting schedule. There have been some changes, so I'm just going to highlight a few things. One is today is February 12th, so that's our first meeting. And then each of your groups will meet 3 times separately. So I'll call it breakout format. So each of your groups will meet once during that window of February 12th to March 5th, once March 5th to April 14th, and then once on either April 30th or for the Building Efficiency, Electrification, and Distributed Energy Resources group, you'll be meeting on May 7th. So the changes that I want to highlight are that originally in the schedule that you saw, April 30th was a final plenary meeting. And we just identified that we needed one more meeting to get through all of the materials. So we tried to minimize disruption. So the Environmental Justice and Equity group and the Transportation Electrification group, you're the lucky ones who don't have a disruption to your schedule. It's the same window that you had before. Low carbon fuels and developing clean electricity generation transmission will meet on the same day, but in the afternoon. And then Building Efficiency, Electrification, and DERS. I just have to thank you all in advance for being flexible, although we're not giving you a choice here. And you're going to meet a little bit later. And then that final plenary meeting where we all get back together again will be on May 21st. And I just want to highlight relating to this a little bit on the focus of the meeting. So there's some fluidity there in kind of when your working group is going to be walking through the different kind of points in that process that I just presented. But I just want to point out that the second meeting where you're meeting in your individual groups is where we'll be incorporating a discussion on the complementary analysis that we've conducted. So looking at that energy wallet and air quality modeling and geospatial mapping. And then finally, there's a couple of additional meetings. One is the presentation of that complementary analysis. We've had to move the date. It's going to take a little bit longer for us to complete that analysis. So that's being rescheduled, but rescheduled kind of between March 5th and 14th, between the first round of meetings and the second round of meetings. And then I just want to point out, because I know that I've mentioned jobs quite a bit, and it's something that's in the bill. It's going to take us a little bit longer to conduct the job study. It's a whole nother modeling exercise that builds on the results of the modeling that Evolved Energy Research and the Clean Energy Transitions Institute have conducted. And so the results of that job study are going to come out in July, and we anticipate kind of a different timeline and deeper policy discussions following a more in-depth workforce analysis that we'll conduct following on the job study. So we'll have some jobs numbers for the November 1st deadline, but this is just going to be a continuing work stream that I wanted to flag. And so again, I mentioned that we have this portal that's always open for written public comment, and it's also where you submit comments when we have these comment periods. And I just want to thank you all again for being here, and hand the floor over to Jeremy, who's going to be kind of teeing up your groups by grounding us a little bit more deeply in the key findings for each of the policy working groups, and getting us to where we can build on those findings to have the policy discussions. So thanks a lot. And Jeremy, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. I see, Alan, your hand is up, so you might want to.
I just thank you for all that. It was very good, Edith, and it's good detailed context. But I wanted to give a little bit more context in the setting that we're in and the time that we're in and how important this is. I was just in Washington, D.C. last week at the NASIO conference. That's our trade association. So it was all the directors and assistant directors from all over the country, all the state energy offices. And two things emerged from that were important and relevant here. One is that everybody was operating under a great deal of uncertainty because of what the administration's doing with the freezing of funds and all the different things that they're doing and the shift in focus. And it created a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty. And we'll have to deal with that and see how that plays out over time. But and that's kind of the downside of what we were talking about in DC last week. But the upside of that was that I was with all 50 states and some of the territories, and there's so much good, innovative stuff happening at the state level that is really well done, really cool, and very focused on the clean energy transition. And one of the things that I walked away with, and many people walked away with, is that with the shift in focus at the federal level, the stuff that we're doing at the state level becomes that much more important. It becomes actually critical or essential to moving forward. So putting all that federal stuff aside, what we're doing here is really very much important. And it was very important 2 weeks ago, and now it's extremely important. And so what we're asking you to do is help us on that endeavor and help us create recommendations that will help us move down that energy transition by commenting on, giving us suggestions as specific and as targeted as possible to help us craft those recommendations in the end that will help us get towards a clean energy transition using all the information, all the modeling that Jeremy's done and our group has excellently worked towards getting together. So it just makes what we're doing here that much more important as opposed to kind of depressing. So I just wanted to emphasize how much we appreciate your being here, and the all 125 of you, so that this is really important work. So my hat's off to you for participating, and please take that all into consideration when we're moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Edith. So what I'm going to do today, results that we're seeing coming out of the modeling process that will tee up conversations going into the working groups. So it's meant to be complementary to the presentation that we gave January 31st. So we'll dive a little bit more into detail on the sector-specific takeaways. And hopefully that will spur some good discussion in the working group session today. What I'm going to kick it off with is a modeling framework, modeling methodology discussion that won't take too long here, but will just set the scene a little bit on how we've approached this problem. And as Edith was describing earlier, this is giving us one piece of the problem or the information required for developing the overall energy strategy. And so understanding what that piece is upfront and what we should be taking away from this going into policy development is an important piece of this. So first, starting with modeling framework, as a recap of what we went through on January 31st, we looked at a number of different study questions here. So these were framed up through the working group process and subject matter expert input over the few months last year that spanned summer and fall. And we started off with a reference scenario, which is answering that first question. What are the key elements of a least cost pathway to meeting Oregon's energy policy objectives? And this was drawing upon the what we have learned from other studies in other regions about what has been shown to be a cost-effective piece of a transition to lower carbon emissions in the future. And the other questions that we were answering with the study here was kind of testing that hypothesis. Is that the cheapest thing to do? As well as looking at what the outcomes of different policy decisions that might actually prioritize other outcomes for Oregon that's not purely economic. It's looking at environmental benefits or jobs benefits, things that are not covered explicitly in this model, but are represented by these different questions or the constraints that we have. And then the third piece here is, what if uncertainty plays a part in not meeting the things that we would like to achieve? So if we don't get as much electrification or we can't build as many resources within Oregon, then what is the consequence of that happening? And that helps us learn something about, if we don't achieve particular policy goals, how much is that going to cost us? And that can help us go into the policy discussion of understanding the cause and effect of not achieving particular strategies or policy goals. So the first question here, looking at a variation of that reference case, was what if energy efficiency and building electrification is delayed by 10 years? So pushing out our targets for electrification into the future by 10 years. 2, what if full transportation electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles is delayed 10 years? So medium and heavy duty in the reference case achieves 100% ZEV sales in 2040. This is looking at what if that were pushed out to 2050. And worth noting here, this scenario achieves the Advanced Clean Trucks goals by 2035. Number 3, what if there is limited demand response participation? There's quite a lot of participation in that case 0, the reference case. What if we don't get as much? Number 4, what if there is limited utility scale electricity generation in Oregon? And this just takes 50% of what we build in that reference scenario and looks at the consequences of that. Where are we getting energy from? What does that do to the investments we need to make and overall costs? Number 5, what if there are higher levels of rooftop solar and behind the meter storage and transmission is limited to reconductoring only? So this one is really investigating if we had more aggressive policy or customer adoption is higher on the demand side, rooftop solar, behind the meter storage, how does that affect the investments we make in the rest of the system? What does that do to costs? And then number 6, what might an alternative portfolio of flexible resources for electricity reliability look like? And we had discussed that in the January 31st presentation. We do build some gas that's running on hydrogen predominantly by the time we get out to those later years in the model, that's providing a reliability service, flexible resource. What if we don't get that? What else do we need to do instead? And going through this analysis, some other questions came up that we also investigated. What the first one here was a variation of that reference case 0A, no change in VMT in the reference scenario. In the reference scenario, we have Oregon's 20% VMT reduction target by 2050 per capita vehicle miles traveled. This one looks at no change in that per capita VMT. 0B, 50% lower tech load growth in the reference scenario. One thing that's coming out of this is that, historically we have seen load growth in a decarbonizing electricity grid as really being driven by electrification of transportation, electrification of other heating, cooling loads. That is not the main driver, at least in the near term, of load growth in Oregon based on forecasts. We are using the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's mid-high forecast for tech load growth, so data centers, chip fabrication, and that's really the largest source of load growth in the near term. So this, the other factor there is that it's highly uncertain whether that comes about. So we're looking here at a lower load growth case for tech loads. And then the final sensitivity question was looking at what if we don't achieve that advanced clean trucks regulation by 2035? We're also delaying the point at which we reach 100% ZEV sales to 2050, just like in the delayed transportation electrification scenario. So this is a delayed transportation scenario plus, where we are taking very little action on electrification through 2035 in medium and heavy duty vehicles. Okay, so modeling methodology, a recap of where we left off on January 31st, and just reiterating for those that were in working group meetings last year, what our process looked like. We've got the energy modeling in that middle bar, and the recap of that is that we are building this bottom-up representation of the demand side, all of the various energy consuming technologies like vehicles, water heaters, space heaters, industrial processes, etc. A representation of what that looks like today, and then how that will change going into the future. And that's dependent on scenario assumption inputs. What are we assuming about electric vehicle sales in the future? Are people buying EVs or ICEs? What are they replacing their gas water heaters, gas boilers with? And all of that builds up a picture of what our energy demand looks like over time. That goes into our supply side optimization, which is modeling all of the various supply chains for energy, electricity, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and limits the emissions going forward to what we're targeting in Oregon. So Executive Order 2004, it's also constraining the investments based on other policies like HB 2021, and making sure that we're compliant with CPP, the Clean Fuel Standard. That's nested in this external inputs and assumptions framework, and we went through identifying what was the best available data to put into these models last year. So where possible, using Oregon-specific data sources, and then what the scenario assumptions are. So first defining what those questions were, and then for each question, how do we define that in terms of the hard numbers, the policies that we're representing, as well as the emissions targets and electricity targets. The modeling is all structured to comply with these laws in Oregon, and shown here is the emissions target for Executive Order 2004, shown with the black line. Our emissions are largely coming from fossil sources in 2024. Those are the gray bars there, and we see those declining pretty significantly by the time we get to 2050. Non-CO2 is shown there in red, and that's coming from fluorinated gases in industry, but mostly from methane and N2O emissions from agriculture. So fertilizer use, agricultural practices, animal agriculture. These are harder to reduce based on studies that have been done already. We've used the EPA's supply curve work on what kind of emissions reductions could we see in Oregon, up to $1,000 a ton on a supply curve. And that's not including conservation. This is not reducing output in the agricultural sector, only identifying technological or practice changes that could result in emissions reductions. And there isn't that much opportunity. So the upshot of this is that in energy, in the gray parts of this diagram, we're actually pushing much further than 80% reductions in order to meet that economy-wide goal by 2050. A note on the type of modeling that we're doing here, we could think of two categories of model. First being forecasting. So forecasting in our definition here would be to project changes based on expected customer behavior over time. So at the moment, we've got existing markets, we've got existing rates, we've got the ways that we dispatch our power system, incentives, different technologies and their operating characteristics. Based on all of that, how would we forecast out the evolution of our energy systems over time? And that would be the result of current policy. But because we're looking so far in the future, we're looking to achieving these emissions goals and electricity goals. Those are not based on current market structures pushing us forward. They're based on achieving a goal in the future and thinking about what pathway should we follow to get there. And because we're looking so far in the future, then all options are on the table. If things like our current market structures, rates, etc., are not serving us well right now, then those are on the table for change. And that's something to think about as we go into policy making for getting to these goals in the future. But our modeling process is this backcasting. So starting with the endpoint and then working backwards to infer customer adoption over time, the types of energy investments we need to make, and understanding the sort of temporal context that we're putting ourselves in, where we need to get to these goals in the future, but we know that investing in particular types of infrastructure, that is likely to stick around once we've invested in it for a while. And we see on the bottom, on the right-hand side there, the number of bites at the apple that we get for different types of technology. So appliances, we may replace appliances, 1, 2, 3 times in the next 30 years. So if somebody's buying an appliance right now, then they're probably going to replace it a couple of times before we get to 2050. And there's multiple bites of the apple. AC and furnaces, a little less because they usually last a bit longer. Vehicles, lifetime of 12 to 20 years, depending on what kind of vehicle we're talking about. So fewer bites of the apple there. And then when we get into industrial equipment and power equipment like power plants and particularly transmission lines, if we're building something now, it is likely to be there in 2050. So understanding that from a policy point of view is important to make sure we're making or taking early action to put us on the right pathway. And that sort of leads into these challenges and opportunities that come out of thinking economy-wide and trying to achieve an economy-wide target. We can do more in one part of the economy, less in another part of the economy, and still reach that target. So the question is, what is the best pathway forward through all of the options that we have on the table? And understanding the interactions between these different sectors of the economy is important as well. In a fossil fuel world, we don't generally think of fuels as being connected to other parts of the economy because we're just using natural gas or we're using derived oil products. But as we push forward into the future, then questions come up on, should we be using biofuels or should we be using hydrogen-derived fuels? And this requires other infrastructure, conversion processes, building out new renewables. And so there are increasing dependencies between our different sectors that we need to take account of. And so we're trying to model to make decisions in this economy-wide, temporal, because now we know something about the future. We're going to these targets by 2050, and spatial context, representing the competition across geographies of different technologies. And it leads us into these two animal-related challenges that hopefully in solving these different questions or answering these different questions, we're elucidating something about how we approach these. The first is the chicken and egg challenge. So what comes first? There's a lot of technology development that needs to happen prior to other more nascent technologies to make them happen. What are the barriers to develop? Where should near-term efforts be focused? And that gets into that chart we just saw on the previous slide about the bites of the apple. When are we making investments? What do we not want to lock ourselves into long-term? And then the second there is whack-a-mole. So doing less in one part of the economy requires more in another. And when we're thinking economy-wide, that's a key question for us. Where are the emissions reductions best taken from? What are the cheapest ways of achieving that? And what is feasible to achieve? You know, things are difficult to ramp up. We have that chicken and egg challenge there. So understanding these costs and feasibility consequences is an important part of setting policy going forward. Our reference scenario, we went through this process last summer of developing the database with these Oregon-specific data sources, and some of these are listed here. So ODOT, EPA moves, which takes data from ODOT, the NEA data for buildings, the SEDS data to benchmark our system against historic use of energy, the DEQ emissions inventory, and then resource investments that are planned already, our data center and tech load forecast data, and population growth going out into the future. And so all of these sources and others have been incorporated to try and give us the most up-to-date database and representation of Oregon's system for this modeling. And then model geography. I touched on this already. We want to put this in a realistic context to capture the competition for resources, both geographically and temporally over time. And this shows Oregon nested in the West among all of the other states. We're modeling every other state in the West, just like we're modeling Oregon, with its emissions goals, its electricity goals, its transformation on the demand side, and its interconnections transmission-wise into other states. And so where there are opportunities for Oregon to be drawing upon imported energy from elsewhere, recognizing that those resources are also going to be valuable to other places. And so capturing that competition in how Oregon would meet its needs in the future. We, from an electricity perspective, divided Oregon into East and West, which is shown on this chart to capture that East-West cross Cascades transmission constraint. And then fuels-wise, we're also looking at Oregon as part of a much larger system. So Oregon is drawing upon national fuels markets for gas, for oil and oil-derived products. As we move forward in time and we move into more biofuels, hydrogen-derived fuels, these are also resources that there is competition for amongst the states that are decarbonizing, and making sure that we're representing the limited resource potential for some of these resources and the costs represented by building out new renewables, new supply chains for these kinds of fuels are all built into the model here. Okay, so jumping into sector insights here, this is leading into the discussions in each of the working groups, and starting off with electricity. Oregon needs more electricity infrastructure. That is most notably driven in the near term by this forecasted data center tech growth. So through 2030, that's the majority of our growth, and we'll see that on the coming slides. But also the switch over to more electrification in vehicles, more electrification in buildings and in industry. This is driving a doubling over time of electricity demand in most of our scenarios here, all driven by meeting our emissions targets, HB 2021. What we are finding across our scenarios is that we've got a mix of in-state, out-of-state resources. We have also got a diverse mix across resource types. And that's coming out of our economic optimization and the potentials for building out these different resource types. It's also likely to be mitigating some risk. We're not putting all of our eggs in one basket when it comes to building out electricity resources. We see this increasingly clean electricity sector over time. It's meeting HB 2021 targets, and it's actually exceeding those because Executive Order 2004 is taking over as a driving force there. And so that's actually, you know, HB 2021 is an implementation policy. It's something that is driving us towards lower emissions from electricity over time. To get to Executive Order 2004 goals, then we need to move further than what HB 2021 is doing for us. We're modeling this as applied to Pacificor, PGE, the ESS which is 62.1% of load. But notably, a lot of the tech growth is happening in places outside of those regions. And those are still allowed to consume emitting electricity. But as we move forward in time, we see this going to 2% or 2 million metric tons, which is 10% of our 2010-2012 baseline, which is a lot lower than what HB 2021 would be doing for us. Electricity balance in the reference scenario shown here, we've got electricity demand on the bottom of this chart, divided up by sectors and new industrial flexible loads. And then electricity generation is shown on the top by resource and whether it's imported energy. Starting on the bottom, we see that big increase in load by 2030 from forecasted data center growth. And then we assume that growth slows down through 2050, but we're still getting 1.5% growth a year. The other sectors, we are also seeing growth. So commercial, productive, some growth over time from electrification. Residential, there's actually a slight decrease over time in electricity demand as we move from resistance heating into more efficient heat pump heating. And then transportation, as we're electrifying the vehicle fleet, we see that growth through 2050, such that over the course of this 25-year period, we see a doubling of electric loads. And that's met with the resources shown on the top. So starting in 2024, we've got a largely hydro system, but also existing unspecified imports, gas, electricity. We've got onshore wind in Oregon East and a small amount of solar as well. Initially, that additional load growth is being met with more imports, as well as increases in the amount of solar and a little bit of onshore wind. Moving forward to 2035 and beyond, our imports don't grow as much as the additions in state of new onshore wind, new solar, and then starting in 2040, we see geothermal electricity coming into the mix as well. As we move forward in time, the amount of gas electricity is decreasing significantly. So it's moving from an energy resource in 2024 to a resource providing capacity reliability in those later years. One note here is that when we show a resource like geothermal, for example, coming online in 2024, or 2040, that brown bar, that is the year that building, development, interconnection has been completed, and it is now contributing to the system. But as we talked about earlier with backcasting and thinking about planning and chicken and egg, there is planning work, development work, building that all needs to happen prior to that. And so action needs to be taken several years in advance for a resource like that to come online. And depending on the resource we're looking at, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, a transmission line, then the lead times for that kind of development vary. This electricity mix is relatively similar across most of our scenarios, but there are notable exceptions to that where we've investigated limitations on what we can build or different priorities. And we see that most notably in limited generation, or scenario number 4, where we can't build as much in state. We can't build as much wind or solar or geothermal. And so the upshot of that is that we have to import more from other places. We see that on the left-hand side chart there, where on the negative side of the axis, these are all things that we're doing less of in this case, less in-state generation. And the positive side of the axis are the things that we're doing more of or replacing that generation with. And that's shown there mostly by increased imports in the green, clean imports. And then in scenario number 5, high DER and limited transmission. In this case, the policy investigated, or the outcome, is that customers are building more rooftop solar over time. And we see that in the orange, and that's displacing grid scale solar and some imports, shown on the negative side of the axis there. We've structured the model to reflect land use and natural resource constraints. And I covered this on the 31st as well, where we're using the Nature Conservancy Power Place West study to estimate where can we build new resources. They did an analysis with 3 different siting levels that include legally protected, administratively protected, and high conservation land areas. We are using the strictest, so the one that incorporates all of those different levels of protection. That's their siting level 3. So in this figure, you can't develop anything on the green areas, and we have limited the potential for new wind, solar resource development to those areas that are not identified as green here. When we tally up what the square miles of land use are, based on the amount of investment in new wind and new solar, then we find that in the reference case, we have 620 square miles of development in Oregon East. And that's total, including the existing development that's out there right now, and 200 square miles in Oregon West by 2050. And that Oregon East black dashed line there is showing where we're starting from in 2024. It's worth noting here that there is some variation in estimates of how much land area wind and solar development take up. We are using the NREL estimates for this, which is 78 square miles per gigawatt for wind and 7 square miles per gigawatt for solar. Across our other scenarios, we see some variation in this. And if we limit the development to 50% of these resources, then we see a 31% reduction in the overall land area used. And if we take out clean gas in that alternative flexible resource scenario, then we actually see a 15% increase in land area used, because some of the upshot of removing that flexible resource is to build more renewables. The other resources that we're building also have a footprint as well. We're just showing wind and solar here because these are the largest contributors. Oregon needs more transmission capacity. What we've modeled in this study is the interconnections between zones, and it's modeled with a linear zonal pipe flow representation. So not meant to be a replacement for detailed transmission modeling, but indicative of the transmission need going forward as we're growing loads, doubling them by 2050, and the changing patterns in energy production and consumption. What we are finding in the expansion of transmission is that we need to build out transmission into Oregon West. We see Boardman-Hemingway transmission built into Oregon East. But across our scenarios, we see the linkages between what is driving new transmission. So in that scenario 6, alternative flexible resources case, if we don't build that clean gas capacity, then we end up building a lot more transmission into Oregon West to maintain reliability. Likewise, in the limited demand response case as well. So those are our kind of interconnected levers here. If we can build more dependable, flexible capacity within zone, then we don't have to build as much transmission. That includes demand response. It includes these new hydrogen burning gas plants. If we build less of those, then we need more transmission. And looking at what we do build in our reference case, which is our sort of lowest build of transmission case, the charts on the right there show what are we building between Oregon East and the zones it connects to. So California North, 0.6 gigawatts, Idaho, 1 gigawatt, Nevada, which we actually don't have existing transmission for, but we do have a potential represented there, 0.3 gigawatts by 2050. And then out to Oregon West, 0.4 gigawatts by 2050, Washington, 0.4. And then the second chart there, Oregon West, 2 other zones it's connected to, which includes Oregon East and Washington, same 0.4 to Oregon East, and then Washington, 1.2 gigawatts. It's worth noting here that there are not current transmission projects identified between Washington and Oregon West. We represented that as an opportunity with a cost, but that need for transmission may be solved by Oregon East, Oregon West transmission. Again, this is not a detailed transmission planning model. Within zone transmission is also in the model. It just doesn't have a physical representation. We're not explicitly representing new lines between nodes within Oregon East, Oregon West, or any other zone, but the costs are represented. So we have high-level multipliers that are based on historical costs per gigawatt hour of load in these zones. And as load grows, the costs of this T&D infrastructure within zone also grows at the same time. And the other piece of this is that as we're building out new renewables, we have these interconnections to connect those renewables into the system. The costs for those are all represented in the model as well. Moving on to fuels here. As a recap from the 31st, what we're seeing is a decrease of 70% in our fuel consumption going from 2024 to 2050. The remaining fuel are these hardest to decarbonize sectors of the economy. Aviation is a good example of that, where there's not a good way to switch away from burning a hydrocarbon right now. So we assume that that's sticking around going forward into the future. But in order to get under our emissions target, then we need to start decarbonizing some of this remaining fuel use. So moving from 2024, we see that there is some clean fuel consumption happening, and that's happening in transportation. That is increasing over time to 2050, such that the majority of our fuel use by 2050 is clean fuel use at that time. And clean fuels here include biogas, bioliquids, e-fuels, which are fuels that are produced from electrolytic hydrogen, longer hydrocarbon chains that could replace gasoline or diesel or other liquid fuels. Hydrogen itself used in end uses, ammonia also produced from hydrogen, and geothermal steam. As a basis of sort of grounding ourselves in how much each of these fuels cost, I've just pulled some of the ranges from literature here. So natural gas, it's typically in the last few years has fallen in the range of $3 to $5 an MMBTU. So this is a very cheap fuel. Gasoline and diesel, $15 to $25 an MMBTU. Electrolytic hydrogen, there are a number of forecasts out there, and I pulled one of them here that's forecasting $6 to $12 an MMBTU in the long term, but that is significantly under where we are right now. Currently, it'd be $30 to $50 an MMBTU. Anaerobic digestion gases, this is really dependent on whether these exist today and are a waste gas coming from different process, or it's dedicated production in the future. So the range is large there, $2 to $18 an MMBTU. And then advanced biofuels, so those things that could be drop-in into, for example, aviation fuel, $16 to $42 an MMBTU. Fuels in the transportation sector decrease due to more efficient electric drive chains and convert to clean. So here I'm highlighting fuel use and electricity use across the different transportation sectors: aviation, light duty vehicles, medium and heavy duty vehicles, and other. And we see in the case of light duty and medium and heavy duty that the majority of the vehicles are electrified by the time we get to 2050 in our reference scenario. So it's electricity mostly, with a small amount of clean fuel being consumed in that final year. Aviation is the sector where the majority of fuel use in transportation sticks around in the long term. And we can see that we don't decarbonize that fuel until we get to that final year, 2050, where this is all decarbonized with a clean fuel option. And then it is a mix of electricity and clean fuel. This is things like rail and shipping. Looking at the other sectors, industry and agriculture, commercial, residential, can see where the energy use in these sectors is coming from on the fuel side. And this is not showing electricity in this case. So there is a significant amount of electricity being used in industry, commercial, residential as we electrify. But on the fuel side here, we are 100% clean fuel in commercial and residential by 2050. And this is largely gas usage at that time. So it's coming from a biogas source. In industry and agriculture, we don't decarbonize too much of the fuel use until we get to 2040. And we're counting here geothermal steam as a source of clean fuel. That's shown in the purple there. And the remaining fossil fuels are decarbonized by biomass or biogas and some e-fuels. Especially by 2050, there's very little fossil fuel use remaining. Our electricity system is relying on installed gas capacity to provide flexibility and reliability. And we're talking about that here from a fuels perspective, because these new clean gas resources can only burn hydrogen or new sources of biogas. And the right-hand side chart there is showing the capacity, electricity capacity going forward in the reference scenario, where in Oregon East, we have existing gas remaining, and that's shown in the dark gray. Oregon West, we're building out this new clean gas resource, and these almost never operate. The use of hydrogen is very expensive, but it's cheap capacity. So it's giving us this contribution towards contingency conditions that is highly valuable. But we see the actual consumption of these expensive gases to be very low. And we can see that on the next chart here. So what I'm showing on the left-hand side is gas supply for existing generators. And then on the right, gas supply for new generators. And we can see the difference there. We're still consuming some fossil gas moving into the 2045, 2050 time period. But this is low capacity factor. It's being turned on during those conditions that are hard to meet with other sources of energy and flexibility. The gas supply for new generators it's much lower, and that's because of the order of magnitude difference in cost between burning a MMBTU of a fossil gas versus an MMBTU of hydrogen or biogas. And so it's at the top of the stack. You wouldn't use that unless you'd already exhausted your other resources. And just to demonstrate that here, I'm showing a day in April, a day in December. The April day, we've got a lot of renewable availability, and that's in that fixed row here. Fixed meaning solar or wind, small hydro. And then we've got hydro, the second row, thermal, the third row, and then imports in the fourth row. And we just don't need a lot of thermal resources in that April day, because we've got an abundance of clean energy coming from in-state and abundance of clean energy to draw upon out of state. In the December day, then we have almost no wind production in this case, and our solar is also lower than what we see in April. We've got a lot of hydro production happening on this day, but it's not enough to be able to meet our energy needs. And so we are turning on our gas supply, which happens very rarely. But here we see the existing gas generation in gray coming online, and then new gas generation in the pink. Our volumes of gas delivered to electricity generators and end users declines over time. We see that here with the gray being natural gas, dark gray for electricity, light gray for direct use. Volumes are significantly lower by 2050, and the majority of that is coming from biogas. Biogas going to remaining direct uses. Electrolysis features for electricity, but it's at very low volumes, much lower volumes than what we're using for direct use. And then biofuels are important to decarbonize the low volumes of remaining fuel use in 2050. So this is putting a finer point on where biofuels are going in the economy. We've got commercial, residential, industry and agriculture, transportation. Transportation is using a reasonable amount of biofuels in 2024, HEFA, FAME, ethanol blending. And then these are decreasing over time. We're electrifying the vehicle fleet at the same time, so our fuel use is much lower. By the time we get to 2050, we're now decarbonizing that aviation fuel, and that's coming from alcohol to X and HEFA. Then commercial and residential, existing biomass that is wood consumption in wood stoves. We see a decline in that over time as we go into more hybrid wood stove and heat pump systems. And then in those later years, biogas to pipeline is the principal means by which we're decarbonizing the remaining natural gas use. And then liquid fuels, e-fuels are imported from other states, whereas hydrogen gas is produced locally. We saw in earlier charts that liquid fuels constitute some of the fuel use in 2050, predominantly in industry. And if it's a liquid e-fuel, it's more cost effective to be producing that out of state and importing it into Oregon. And we see that with the imports row here. E-fuels, ammonia, these are largely imported in later years. In Oregon, the majority of hydrogen is produced and used for vehicles. So we see that hydrogen gas is going into industry actually, and then liquefied hydrogen. This is hydrogen for fuel cell vehicles. And bringing this back up to the bigger picture and looking overall at imported versus Oregon produced fuels, then we see imports decline over time. And that's largely because fossil fuels are declining. And then clean fuels, those are ramping up primarily in imported fuels by 2050. But the relatively low volumes shown on the Oregon side, those are also about doubling by 2050 as well. Moving into transportation here, the key findings for transportation are first that electrification is playing a significant role in reducing system-wide energy demands across all scenarios. And this is despite our tech sector growth. So electrification of transportation is offsetting the increases in energy use that come from our tech sector. Early adoption of electric vehicles, including medium and heavy duty vehicles, reduces the costs of decarbonization. EVs are a significant driver of increased electric loads, but they provide a net benefit to the grid if managed flexibly. So we can shift that charging around so that it's not having such an impact on peak loads. And unlike our electrification of heating loads, where those are driving some peak load growth, we can fill in around that peak load growth with the charging of EVs, such that we get better utilization of our distribution infrastructure. Reducing VMT per capita provides significant value, but what we're not showing when we present those results is the cost of achieving those VMT reductions. And that might come from new public transport investment, new zoning, moving to more remote work. All of these things, there's potentially some costs associated, and we're not showing that side of the coin. And then finally, low carbon fuels plays a strategic role in decarbonizing transportation. And this role increases as the pace of transmission or transportation electrification slows. Starting here with the impact on economy-wide energy demand for our transportation scenarios. The first shows reference, which is the same 22% reduction that we saw on January 31st. Then we've got our no ACT scenario, where we get to a 20% reduction, and delayed transportation electrification, 21% reduction. More notably, though, here than the overall reduction is the changes in fuel use. So the remaining consumption of primarily diesel. We see in the no ACT case that diesel consumption is 25% higher in 2035 and 270% higher in 2050 than in the reference scenario. And you can pick that up looking on the chart there. The diesel fuel is the sort of medium gray color. And then delayed transportation electrification, diesel consumption, it's basically the same in 2035 because ACT is complied with in both reference and delayed TE. But by the time we get to 2050, it's 110% higher diesel consumption. Cost-wise, what we see here is, again, highlighting the transportation scenarios. We've got no ACT in green, we've got delayed transportation electrification in blue, and our no change in VMT sensitivity shown in orange there. Delaying our transportation electrification but complying with ACT is increasing our costs by about 14 billion cumulative relative to the reference case over the next 25 years. The no change in VMT, about 22 billion, and then our no ACT, about 30 billion cumulative net present value. If we look at sensitivities on our zero emission vehicle costs, so changing the cost of zero emission vehicles by +10%, -10% capital and fixed costs, and that includes the installation costs, the charger costs. We see that the variance here, again, this is showing delayed TE relative to our reference scenario, but in annual costs. It doesn't change the order of whether we would want to do electrification. Even with +10, -10%, we're still seeing significant benefit of electrifying faster in the medium and heavy duty vehicle fleet in the reference case. Reviewing what our sales, stocks, and energy demand look like, I'm first putting up here light duty vehicle sales. This is the same in all of our scenarios, but it's worth noting the transformation that's happening in that sector because it is a major contributor to the demand reductions and emissions reductions that come from transportation. Light duty vehicle sales here for most of the fleet there, then we're going to 100% sales by 2035. And we see that reflected in the stocks here. So based on the lifetime of these vehicles, stock rollover, and going to this high amount of sales in a relatively short time period here, our stock of light duty vehicles is fully electrified by the time we get to 2050. And that reflects in the energy demand chart on the bottom here, where we see significant reductions in energy consumption by 2050. And part of that is that we're also getting a 20% reduction in VMTs over that same time period. We look at medium and heavy duty vehicles here, then we can see the impact of our no ACT and our delayed TE scenario. So in the reference scenario, where we're reaching the 100% ZEV sales by 2040, we're also achieving the ACT goals by 2035. And that shows a pretty significant reduction in energy demand over time and a pretty electric vehicle fleet by the time we get out to 2050. The no ACT case, we are not complying with ACT through 2035, and then we are going to a 100% ZEV sale target in 2050. that filters into the stocks more slowly with electric vehicles, and we see this higher consumption of energy over time. And then delayed TE falls somewhere in between that, where we're achieving ACT by 2035, but in the later years, our sales are going to 100% more slowly than in the reference scenario, and that is reflected in slightly higher energy use by the time we get to 2050. We look at our reference scenario at the average miles per gallon equivalent of passenger vehicle stocks. This shows the impact of the electrification policy here. So they're delivering huge efficiency gains over time. And this is just applied to passengers. So we're looking at light duty vehicle side here, starting at an average of 25 in 2024 and moving to 125 in 2050. So that's highlighting the overall impact here on efficiency and reducing the overall size of our energy pie. And we think about this in terms of energy use today. So if we were to reduce our energy use through electrification in the transportation sector, what percentage of today's energy would that reduce over time? And that would be equal to 27%. And if we break that out by light duty vehicles and medium and heavy duty vehicles, about 20% of that is attributed to light duty vehicles, and the remaining 7% to medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so even though our scenarios have been investigating medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification, and that's in part because light duty vehicles are forecast to become cost effective, electric vehicles are forecast to become cost effective relatively shortly here versus their ICE counterparts. The light duty vehicle fleet is very important in achieving energy reductions and emissions reductions over time. Transportation fuel consumption is driven by the pace of electrification. So if we compare reference, no ACT, and delayed transportation electrification, we see light duty vehicles are the same across the board. We didn't change anything about those assumptions. Medium and heavy duty vehicles, that's where we see these differences, where it's largely electric in our medium and heavy duty vehicles by 2050. In the case of no ECT, we have a lot more fuel use remaining, and that needs to be decarbonized. So it's coming from clean fuel in 2050. And then in delayed transportation electrification, again, falling somewhere in the middle where we've got clean fuel use as part of the mix in 2050. Flexible loads are dependent on customer participation in the future. So in our reference scenario, our largest contribution to flexibility is coming from managed charging on the transportation side. And that's shown by the blue part of the diagram on the right-hand side there. We're getting just over 1 gigawatt of flexible load contribution from our transportation sector by 2050. If we limit the amount of participation, and we do that in our limited flexible load scenario, then we get significantly less contribution from transportation and from the other sectors. And that's costing us about $4 billion on a cumulative net present value basis over the next 25 years. Jumping into buildings here, energy efficiency, building electrification, PV and DERs are important to a least cost pathway. And we see that when we delay or limit the amount of demand side technology that can participate here. The right-hand side is showing the costs for the scenarios where we have changed something about that demand side participation. The first scenario there, 1, delayed EE and BE, energy efficiency and building electrification, that is about $17 billion more expensive on a cumulative basis over the next 25 years than the reference scenario. Scenario number 3, limited DR, $4 billion, as we just looked at. And scenario number 5, high DER, limited transmission. In this case, limited transmission is not really a major constraint here because we didn't build out enough transmission to exhaust the opportunities for reconductoring. So this is really a high DER scenario, and that's driving up our costs by about $7.5 billion cumulative here. It's worth noting, though, that this is avoiding the investment in grid scale technologies. And so it may play a role both in terms of customer choice on the demand side, but also in limiting challenges related to siting and permitting a large amount of resource on the grid scale side. Again, looking at these charts where we've got sales, stock, and energy demand, but on the building side, this is showing our residential space heating. In the reference case, then we've got this pretty rapid transition into air source heat pumps over time, and that's reflected in the stock and the significant reduction in energy demand. Our delayed EE and BE case, then this is pushing things out in time by 10 years, and so we see this larger amount of fossil fuel use, electric resistance use in those later years, and that drives up our overall energy consumption. Commercial side, same thing here, where we had different targets for small commercial. Small commercial mirrored what was happening on the residential side, and then large commercial, 50% of buildings. We had 15% heat pump, 10% electric in 2030, and then 50% heat pump, 40% electric / hybrid by 2040. And that's reflected in the reference set of charts there. And then delayed EE and BE, pushing those out by 10 years. Again, that similar trend of just driving up energy demand because we still have more fossil fuel use in the economy. Looking again at our residential sector and how much energy use we see in buildings over time, what I've done here is shown the energy use as a percentage of what we're consuming in 2024. So 2024 is 100%. As we switch into heat pump usage and more efficient appliances over time, we get to 53% by 2050. So a pretty significant reduction in energy demand and improvement in efficiency that is shrinking the overall size of the energy pie over time. Looking at our delayed EE and BE case in a bit more detail here, delaying energy efficiency building electrification increases fuels and electricity use. And this chart is showing the difference to our reference scenario. So what are we consuming more of on the positive side? What are we consuming less of on the negative side? And we put this in terms of percentages. So by the time we get out to 2050, we're consuming about 6% more energy than in the reference scenario. And the trend over time is that we're consuming more fossil fuels, primarily fossil gas. We're having to decarbonize more fuel earlier with clean fuels, and we see that with the clean liquids in 2035 and 2040. And by the time we get to 2045, 2050, then the majority of that additional fuel use is met with clean fuels. So predominantly clean gas and some clean liquids as well. The increased cost of this case is $17 billion on an NPV basis. And then just reiterating earlier, but taking this from a buildings perspective, if we are installing more rooftop solar in Oregon West, then it reduces the need for imports and it reduces the need for grid scale solar in Oregon East. So it has that effect of potentially mitigating any challenges of siting and permitting these large scale grid scale resources. Increasing rooftop solar substitutes for some grid scale solar builds. And so this is showing that point in a little finer detail, where split into Oregon East on the top and Oregon West on the bottom. If we're building more rooftop solar, which is shown in scenario 5 there, then we're reducing the amount of grid scale solar that's being built, and the majority of that reduction is happening in Oregon East. And then revisiting flexible loads here, but from the buildings perspective, we're getting significant contribution from residential and some from commercial in our reference scenario. That's the yellow and the pink. If we limit that, then that is halved in our limited demand response case. But we also looked at this high DER limited transmission case. The headline of that case is around the rooftop solar, but we also increased significantly the participation of customers in demand response programs, and that increased the amount of non-coincident flexible load from about 1.6 gigawatts to 3.4 gigawatts. So there's significantly more opportunity there for customer participation and flexible load reduction. This requires a large portion of the electric heat pumps, water heaters, space heaters to be participating in these programs in the future to get that increase. One of the things that we didn't investigate with this study, and we don't really have the numbers to pull from to put costs to it, is what is the value of this increased demand response? It's going to have some value because it's going to avoid having to invest in other flexible resources. But what we found in other studies is it tends to diminish in marginal value the more that you add. And to conclude here, key takeaways at a 10,000 foot view, so bringing this back up again, electrification and energy efficiency are key to reducing the size of the overall energy pie and to cost containment. So all of these measures that we're taking on the electrification side are minimizing the size of the energy system that we need to build to meet those energy demands. Fuels play a strategic role in the transition with a shift towards clean fuel alternatives towards 2050, and that we've seen that by 2050 the majority of the fuel being consumed is clean fuel to get under that emissions target. All scenarios indicate a need to build infrastructure in Oregon, and tech loads are the biggest driver of electricity demand growth. But there's a lot of uncertainty around those loads. We see in our Northwest Power Council forecast significant growth in Oregon, and Oregon is an attractive place to build data centers, but it's a relatively short time frame for a developer of a new data center to shift from one location to the other based on their development criteria. And so how this plays out over time is uncertain, but driving some major infrastructure questions and investments in the near term. So I will leave it there and pass it back to Edith.
Thanks, Jeremy. So we are about 5 minutes ahead of schedule, which is great. I think it leaves us 5 extra minutes for Q&A or to jump into the breakout groups. I'd like to suggest that we break here, and then we'll get into the questions and answers after the break. So let's give ourselves 10 minutes plus 2, so we'll be back at 10:50, just so we have a nice round number to work with. Thanks everyone for your attention, and see you in about 10 minutes. Ask everybody to come back to us, and we're going to be kicking off the Q&A. So I've been tracking, and the team has been tracking the questions in the chat, and I know that some of the questions have been answered along the way that we could answer along the way, and there are some that that we'll want to just put to Jeremy live here. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Jessica, who's been tracking the chat most closely and has teed up, I believe, the questions that we'd like to start with.
Hey everybody, by way of introduction, I'm Jessica Rikers, and I manage the technology and policy team at Odo. So we do have a number of questions, and I just want to flag, I'm trying to organize these sort of by sector working group areas of focus. So in particular, Rebecca, you had 2 questions, and I'm going to have you ask them in different places. So don't worry, I didn't forget either one of them. So also, if you have questions that you have not already put in the chat, please take a moment to throw those in there so that I can get them on the list. I'm going to kind of start with some questions that we got around electricity generation. I will ask the person who asked the question to come on unmute yourself and ask the question as well. So Rebecca, you had a question about turbine upgrades and wind projects. Would you like to ask that for Jeremy?
Yes, thank you. So this question was specifically about wind turbines, since I had another question about combustion turbines. But I was just curious, I know that there have been some repowering projects in the Northwest where some older wind projects where they've come in and upgraded the turbines. And were any of those types of projects assumed when it came to land use and footprint of more megawatts of wind? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually one that along the way we weren't doing that. We thought, well, this needs to happen. So any existing wind or solar project was repowered going forward, just to take advantage of ownership of the site, the interconnection, etc. So that seemed to make the most sense. So everything that is retiring is basically upgraded with the latest vintage of wind or solar technology in that year.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Our next question around electricity generation is from Kelly Hole, who had a question around energy imports. Kelly, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Hi. Thanks so much. My question was about the estimates for clean energy inputs. Do those show where in the region we expect those to come from moving forward? I saw that you included a statement about the region as a whole and looking at other states as well, but I was just wondering if you had an expectation of where those imports were going to come from.
Mm-hmm. So the way that we modeled it, just because Oregon doesn't have a REX representation, it wasn't REX specifically from like plants across the West. We just had to make sure that the imported power was coming from a clean source. So it's all physical representation, but depending on the hour, it's going to be different plants around the West. So it's hard to say it is a specific plant here or here. But the majority of the new investment in resources outside of the West are things like Montana, Wyoming wind. So that would be a big source. We allowed geothermal development to happen in other states as well. So Washington is building out geothermal power, and that's a source of imported power coming in depending on the hour. And then solar coming from the Southwest, so California, Arizona, New Mexico. Depending on the time of day and the conditions across the West, then you'll get flows coming up into Oregon. So there's a physical representation to make sure that it is all clean and sourced from a particular place, but it is not individual investments attributed to Oregon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. We have a couple questions that have come up around nuclear, and I just wanted to add to the question of how we modeled nuclear. So nuclear was included as a potential resource in the model, but we did constrain it from being developed in Oregon based on existing law. And so for those folks who've added in there that it would be good to explore nuclear in Oregon, and since there's some bills that are currently up around that and there's interest in it. That's something that you could potentially discuss within the working group that's focused on electricity generation as a policy consideration. We didn't model it and the model's closed now, so we don't have that opportunity to go in and model something like that. But it was based around our assumption at the very beginning, which is we would model existing policy. Next question that I have is just general interest in understanding how the model could tell us something about what if there is curtailment or dam removal. And I wanted to add before I kind of hand it over to Jeremy about what the model does tell us about limits in generation. We have an alternative scenario that does that. But again, we modeled existing policy. Dam removal is not existing policy, so it was not included in the modeling results. But Jeremy, do you want to cover a little bit about the modeling scenario we looked at with reduced access to electricity generation and what that could tell us about not having those kinds of resources as readily available.
Sure. Yeah, I think to start with, I can tell you how we did model hydro. We're using Power Council forecasts of the climate change impact on output from dams across the West. And so that is an update on, we previously used historical, now we're using this forecasted data from Power Council. We're running a low hydro year, a medium hydro year, and a high hydro year, and we're limiting the ramping capability of the hydro system to a 1 hour ramp and a 6 hour ramp based on what the Power Council is forecasting. The low renewable scenario or limited generation scenario, that one is impacting wind, solar, and geothermal. So you'd only build 50% of the growth from a reference case, but it would be a similar effect to the limiting hydro, which basically you're having to replace the energy with resources that come from out of state. So you're increasing your imports. The thing that that scenario would not reflect is that you may be losing some flexibility as well. There's a controllability to the hydro system that you would be reducing, and so you may have to replace that with some additional resource investment. But we didn't look specifically at that case, so we don't know what we would need to be building.
Thanks, Jeremy. A quick question going back to nuclear. Jeremy, and I don't know if you said this, it's really hard for me to monitor the chat and listen to Jeremy's answer. So if said, please just note. But how much nuclear did end up showing up in the reference scenario from out of state?
So we actually didn't get any nuclear build out of state happening. We allowed for small modular reactors to be built. And the reason, so in past studies, we've seen that being built. We saw some being built in Washington and Idaho, in other places around the West on the quantities of, 0.5 gigawatt to 1 gigawatt in the states that it showed up. We did not allow for advanced geothermal in those scenarios. And in this case, we're allowing advanced geothermal to be built everywhere in the West. And it's giving you a similar service where it's a dispatchable firm capacity. And so I think that's the reason why we don't see nuclear now. It's displacing that. But what that would come down to is cost ultimately. And the costs for SMRs are uncertain. Costs for advanced geothermal are uncertain. And I think those are somewhat substitutable resources depending on where costs end up. And so it would be dependent in the future on where we get to in technology development.
Great. Thanks. All right. So I'm going to move on to some fuels related questions now. That doesn't mean we can't ask any more generation questions, but I did kind of want to group them together. So the first fuels question I have is around sustainable aviation fuel from David Vantoff. Sustainable aviation fuel is often referred to as SAF. So just for clarity there. But David, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, Jessica, I'm trying to remember. I had a couple questions, but I guess it was to try and better understand how much the modeling assumes SAF is coming into aviation sector between now and say 2040, as compared to coming in 2050. I assume there's some kind of a ramping assumption, but I wasn't as clear as to what that was.
Yeah, so that's a good question that applies to other areas of the modeling as well. So what we're showing is based on the costs of these fuels that in 2050 it's 100% decarbonized, but prior to that we don't see that much clean fuel use in aviation fuel. But I wouldn't take that as to say that it shouldn't be there. Just because the costs of producing a clean fuel for aviation versus gasoline versus diesel versus any liquid fuel fraction are relatively similar. And so there is a level of degeneracy between those things in our model. You could be putting clean fuel towards aviation fuel, or you could be putting it towards diesel. The cost is just relatively similar. And so I would not look too much into the fact that we're just ramping quickly into 2050. It could be a much more gradual ramp that happens. And from a policy perspective, that would probably be desirable.
So that, sorry, just as a follow-up, that would be something that the fuels group would be looking at as in the policy conversations, is that kind of a ramping rate, and what might lead to increased use of SAF or renewable diesel or whatever sooner than later.
Yeah, I think that would be a topic for discussion in those groups.
And sorry, last real quick one on this is, when you're talking about SAF, Jeremy, are you thinking of just only zero GHG SAF, or are you also thinking about, you know, the current types of SAF, which would be maybe a 70% reduction fuel?
So it can be blended in our model. So it can take, but the source of a clean fuel beyond ethanol and fog and the existing biofuels that are out there, we're assuming they are zero carbon. So if you're taking, say, like cellulosic ethanol in the future, or cellulosic materials, and you're producing a fuel from that, we're assuming that that would be zero carbon. So it really depends on timing. If you're using an existing fuel source, then there's going to be some carbon associated with it. If it is a new fuel source in the future, we're assuming it is carbon free. And in that 2050 time period, that would be, actually, it's not all carbon free. There is some portion of the existing fuel supply right now that is being used in aviation at that point. So it is just dependent. And I think that we are taking this very black and white. Existing has an emissions factor associated with it, and new doesn't. But that's kind of dependent on the supply chains that are producing those fuels in the future.
Thanks.
Yeah, and the last thing, and I guess this is more for just the subgroup that'll be breaking out, but I think it's important to not just consider zero emission, but also lower emission sources in the kind of the conversion period between now and 2050.
Thanks. Okay, next fuels question, Rebecca. You're up again. Now you can ask your question around natural gas turbine generation.
Thank you. I know that RHA, we mentioned this in all of our submitted comments, but I just saw in one of the graphics so little, you know, the expected the tapering off of natural gas use in the state. And our understanding from some of the OEMs is that even the 100% hydrogen turbines, or turbines that could run on 100% hydrogen, would still need some natural gas at startup. And so was just wondering if that had in fact been incorporated into the modeling in any way. Thank you.
We are assuming that it's 100% hydrogen in those future years. So that's either it's a simplification of what needs to happen, and you know, we do still have natural gas burn happening in existing, so that could be covered just given the very low volumes of hydrogen that we're burning in the results that we're presenting here, or that we have a technology at that point that doesn't require natural gas. The other factor there is that we do have the opportunity in the model for producing synthetic natural gas that comes from hydrogen. The model is not choosing to do that because producing a synthetic natural gas and then burning it is an additional step that adds cost over just burning the hydrogen. But you could imagine a future if that were a technological constraint where you're producing some level of synthetic natural gas that is serving that role if you need to be 100% clean.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Rebecca. Great questions. I'm gonna move on to some questions around electrification. And we had a question from Jana Jarvis about the cost, how, Jeremy, how you, excuse me, I'm just gonna have Jana ask her question because obviously I can't do it. Jana.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Jeremy, I do have a big question. You have an assumption that delay in the ACT will cost X number of dollars, and the ACT is in effect this year. It only allows zero emission vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and there's a tremendous amount of inefficiency in today's technology. So it requires a lot more trucks in order to be able to meet today's demand. And both from the fact that there's range constraints and payload constraints. So were those did you just compare it on a one-to-one basis, or did you take some of those inefficiencies into consideration in your model?
We did replacement on a one-to-one basis. So we require the same amount of vehicle miles traveled that has energy inputs based on the efficiency of an electric motor. But where there are end uses that would require multiple vehicles and replacement, we didn't factor that into the analysis.
Well,
so
well I
it's a
will tell
one-to-one
you,
swap.
you've got at least a 25% inefficiency in payload, and probably you've got a range that's about a fifth or a sixth of what you can do in a diesel truck. So that would create a lot more inefficiencies. You'd have to have a lot more trucks on the road in order to carry the same volume of freight that we are carrying today. So I think that needs to be part of your consideration when you're looking at your cost analysis.
And I'll just add, Jana, I don't think that we're assuming that heavy duty trucks are electrifying today. We're assuming that other trucks that can be electrified today, things like transit buses and medium duty trucks, like you see all those Amazon vans driving around, those are probably what's electrifying today. And the model doesn't get that specific into the types of vehicles that are being electrified, but I think some of the assumptions sort of look at, we're not going to electrify things where there aren't options available. So,
but the ACT requires that you do,
yes.
And that's the problem. So when you start talking about it costs X number of dollars to delay it, but the product doesn't meet the needs, you've got an issue there.
Yes, absolutely. And I should be clear. Yes, there are some requirements for heavy duty trucks in there, but I didn't want it to sound like all heavy duty trucks were.
No, but even at 7% today, it's huge in inefficiencies. So that's my point.
Thanks, Jana.
Thank you.
All right, next question is from David Heslem. He had some questions about flexible load behind the meter participation. David, did you want to jump in and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is David from Earth Advantage. And Jeremy, just reviewing the information you had there on the DERs, it looked like it was identifying that in residential and commercial buildings, it would just be from the water heating, space heating, and AC. And I was wondering if you also modeled the ability for electric vehicle charging, discharging, and also battery charging and discharging behind the meter at residential and commercial buildings to be resources as well.
Yeah, so a good clarifying question, actually, because in the presentation, it was broken up into buildings and transportation. And in the building sector, I only was talking about buildings, but a large portion of that flexibility is coming from transportation charging. In fact, the largest portion is in there. And so we definitely took that into account. Behind the meter storage is also in there, and it's in there in small amounts in the reference case, much larger amounts in the DER case. And I didn't talk about that as a behind the meter customer flexible load, but it is in there providing a large amount of flexibility in our DER scenario.
So it shows up on that slide where it's like the flexible loads dependent on participation in the future. it's in the calculus there, or it's not in that calculus and it's over in the transportation?
It's actually, so the transportation is in all of those graphics, but behind the meter storage is considered a separate resource from what I'm showing in those charts. That's just showing vehicle managed charging, and then residential and commercial heating, water heating, and air conditioning flexible loads.
Okay. I mean, the main reason I bring it up from a policy context is, the service at those buildings is going to be what the energy is being transmitted through. And so we have to just, from a code standpoint and things like that, the buildings have to be able to handle all the loads that are moving back and forth through them as a participant with the grid. And I would assume anything where the resource is behind the meter, we have to have it in that bucket over there because the building has to be able to participate.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think maybe it's a question of how we present those results. We can think about how to show that in a clearer manner.
Yeah, just when we get into the buildings work and the DERs, it'll be important because so that we can have all stakeholders understand that's the plan. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So I have another question from Charlie Tracy about how the model looks at the electricity distribution system upgrades for electrification.
Thank
sorry.
you. I'll just weigh in there that there's a lot of discussion about transmission, and obviously transmission is super important. But when we talk about electrification for like transportation, light vehicles, that we're looking at what that does to our grid and what kind of upgrades we have to do on the distribution system. So I was wondering if the model talked about that at all or looked at the costs associated with it.
Yeah. So this is an area where we have to stay necessarily high level, because if you look across distribution systems, even within the same service territory, the costs are significantly different. And the way that we've done that is to take the EIA's regional multipliers for cost of distribution system upgrades. They're presented on a dollar per megawatt hour basis. And then we've used historical investments in distribution infrastructure based on whether it's like a capital investment for peak infrastructure, or whether it's a maintenance or energy related investment, and then broken that up into a peak load investment versus a energy transfer investment. So that dollar per megawatt hour number has been broken up into what's related to peak and what's related to other things. And then we've tracked what the impact on peak load looks like, and what the impact on energy transfers are, and used that to calculate what are the impacts on distribution costs. So it's using historical data, but it's trying to break it up into a peak and non-peak investment. And so when you're putting on distribution or flexible behind the meter demand response programs or behind the meter battery systems, those can avoid peak and reduce the overall costs.
Right.
And so that's in the model.
Okay, that's good to hear, because I think that your ability to control when that charging happens, can change the costs from quite high to totally unnecessary. So it's good that the model is looking at that.
Yeah, and I think that should be taken again as this is looking down from pretty high, like 10,000 feet on that problem, and what it comes down to is a very node by node, distribution system by distribution system problem of planning that system into the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to pass it back to Edith now. I do see that Mark, you threw a question into the chat. I'm going to do my best to have that answered in the chat for you, but we are at time to move forward. If your question wasn't answered and I missed it somehow, please flag that for me in the comments. And if you have any other questions, throw them in there and we'll do our best to get you a response today. And if not, we'll do it later. And with that, I will pass it back to Edith.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks everybody for the great questions. So we're in a few moments, you should automatically go into your breakout groups. If that doesn't happen and you'll just remain in the main room here. And at the bottom of your screen, you should see a menu come up that lets you select a group. So plan A is you go directly into the group. That's what should happen for most people. Plan B, you can select the group. C, if you still have a problem or you end up in the wrong group, just rejoin the main room and we'll help you. And if you have any questions, Josh Price is paying attention to the chat to help you out. So with that, thanks everybody for your attention. After the breakout groups, we're not going to come back together. We'll just end. So really appreciate everybody being here today and see some of you in the group that I'll be joining. Thanks.
So anyone who's still here in the main lobby, there's 4 squares at the bottom of your screen. It says breakout sessions. Or there, oh, nope, you go to the person on the little person that says participants, and you can join one of the 4 breakout groups. Yes, Michael?
Trying to figure out how to get into a breakout group on generation and transmission.
Okay, so on the bottom right, next to the chat function, it says participant.
Correct.
And you would go to, there should be the main part, and then there's a little button at the very top that says breakout session, and you could be able to join that way. There's a little button that says breakout, and it should show all 4 of the different groups.
I don't see that on my screen. Let me can you tell me where that is again on the screen?
So you clicked on you clicked on the participant button on the bottom right.
Correct.
And then it should show say participants, and it shows who's here right now. There are like 7
Yes.
people. And then
Yes.
right next to main webinar, it says breakout sessions. Can you see that?
No.
No.
We can go ahead and manually do that, Josh. Which breakout session are you supposed to be in?
The one I'd like to go to is generation and transmission.
Got that, Stacy?
Which one is that on? We have them titled differently, Josh.
Developing clean.
Yep, there you go. I'm sending you now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And hi, Stacy. This is Kara Saylor on the phone. Low carbon fuels. Would you pop
Low
me there?
carbon fuels. Yep, I'm getting you right now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cara, I don't know if you have to select anything on your phone to actually head over there. Oh, she did it.
Michael's still
And
not being moved.
Michael,
This is Michael Graham with Clean Cities.
You want to go to the developing clean energy electricity, Michael?
That's correct.
Yep. And Michael Graham, which one did you want to go to?
Low carbon fuels and transportation electrification were the two topics that you all wanted me to participate in.
Which one would you like to go to of those two?
Probably the transportation electrification topic.
Okay, Stacy, will you send Michael Graham to transportation? And for some
Thanks,
reason,
Stacy.
Michael Minton.
hey there. Oh, and I think, Michael Mitten. You should have a pop-up maybe that says join that you need to select.
Michael Mitten does not see that.
Oh, okay. And Michael, the participants window is not giving you an option to join any of those as well.
Correct.
Okay, I'm gonna pull you back out and then I'm going to send you back in there and see if anything pops up on your screen to join the room.
All right, I'll do that.
Okay, all right. Oh wait, which room were you in? Sorry about that.
He's in developing clean.
Developing clean. Okay, keep an eye out.
Yeah, it says show all breakout sessions. And let's see here. It just shows transportation for some reason.
And there's no room to scroll and maybe.
I'm scrolling it. It just has transportation and all the participants and gives me the option to join.
What
Oh, it does have a drop down menu. Let me look
okay,
at that.
there you go.
Developing clean. Yes, I'm
There
sorry.
you go.
My bad. I think I can join.
Okay, great.
And we have 2 people left in the main lobby here. If either of you want to join, please let us know.
And Josh, should I stop recording since it's just going to be the screen from here on out?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, if you want to, I can continue to record just in case.
Yeah, let's just continue to record.
Okay.
I can.
Yeah. Yep.
I just want to see what happens, and it
Yep.
might. I just want to make sure anything else we're doing gets
Okay.
recorded.
Sounds
so.
good. Yep.
Casey, do you want to end the recording and close this meeting?
Yeah, I'm doing that right now. I'm just saving files.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.